Hi, I'm Jodie Rizzo-O'Brien, part of the AWI Extension South Australia team. In this 10-minute talk, we're going to hear from Hannah Griffiths about the potential benefits of new pasture legumes for livestock.
POD's project as a whole is quite large. We have sites across the state in the Upper Eyre Peninsula, the Murray-Mallee and the Barossa and Adelaide Hills area. Now, the project has the goal of improving soil health by lengthening out the pasture growing season and also improving ground cover. So we've got growing pasture for longer parts of the year. So one part of the trial that I wanted to share with you today is our defoliation trial at Mount Crawford in the Adelaide Hills, where we are using mowing to get some ideas on how these newer pasture legumes will be affected by grazing. So throughout the project, we work with farming systems groups. For this particular trial, it's Barossa Improved Grazing Group, or BIG, and they help us to find the producers and the locations that can be a part of our trial. And I'll actually let Julian give you a bit of an idea of why he joined us in this trial as our host.
When we bought this new property at Mount Crawford, we found ourselves in a situation where we inherited pastures that had a lot of very old subclovers, quite prostrate, bred effectively for mainly sheep, I guess, and many of them have become naturalised. The problem with those were that the moment we started to lose a little bit of subsoil moisture, we started to see them fall away. So I started to investigate what else we could plant in terms of legumes that might kick on into the late spring, early summer months. It just was rather fortuitous when the Drought Hub contacted BIG and asked whether or not there were any sites that might prove interesting. Last year was not a great year, and yet we saw a pretty good response, particularly when we compared how it performed in that critical late spring, early summer period, and even some of the established those medics and clovers that were part of the comparative trial, how they started to fall away, and the Ceradella certainly hung on. And then when we had a couple of those rainy events, it seemed to freshen up and continue going, which was all very hopeful. We put cattle in there and grazed it really, really heavily. In fact, I thought that maybe I had overgrazed it, but the results, I think, to this year, given how incredibly poor the year has been, give me great hope that Ceradella has a future on acid country.
Now the site at Julian's is acid, so it had a soil pH of 6.3 after liming. It's quite sandy, and it has a large amount of old subclovers, which also happen to be estrogenic. And Julian was looking for something that was going to survive dry periods in spring and thrive on those acid sandy hills in Mount Crawford. Because of Julian's interest in Ceradellas, we put in 3 varieties, so 2 French Ceradellas and 1 yellow Ceradella. We also had a new variety of medic, one of subclover, a vetch, a balancer clover, and an arrowleaf clover. With a total of 8 varieties, we sowed them in late May 2023. For small plot trials, they were quite large, so 6 by 10 metres. In 2023, we monitored how these varieties looked by themselves by spraying out everything else that was coming up in those plots. And then this year, we've backed off, we've let all the weeds and all the volunteers come up to see how well these newer varieties compete with everything else. It can be quite tricky to evaluate the benefits for livestock when you're using smaller plot trials, because we don't have the space and the fencing to sow and graze paddocks of each one of the varieties we're interested in. So as I mentioned, we have quite large plots for a small plot trial, and we've split those larger 6 by 10 metre plots up into smaller areas that are mowed with just a normal push mower more or less frequently. So we have some plots that are mowed every 2 weeks, and that represents a continuous grazing by a lower density of stock. We've got some plots that are mowed every 6 weeks, and that represents a more rotational style of management. And then our controlled plots we cut once in late October to demonstrate what it would look like cut for hay. Now, this isn't completely representative of grazing, particularly around animal selective grazing habits and nutrient recycling, but it does allow us to get a bit of an idea on how those plants respond to being cut, and allows us to run some tests on what is the quality of the feed and how that changes over the course of the year and with a different pattern of use. We found the unmowed plots hardened off and senesced at roughly the same time as the medics and subclovers, but the cut plots for the ceredellas, they managed to remain green for much longer, and we had some quite heavy rainfall in late November, and those cut plots of ceredella were able to sort of come up, and we had good quality feed coming up throughout December, January, while the subclover and medic plots, all the background around it, just weren't able to utilise that rainfall, which I think is one of the most exciting things we saw in this trial. Now, since all of these pasture legumes are obviously legumes, they had relatively high protein content. I would say across all of the species and all of the treatments, the protein was around or above 16%, which is sufficient for any class of stock. Energy tended to be a bit more variable, but where we saw the most interesting results as a response to cutting was in the area of fibre. So neutral detergent fibre, or NDF, affects how quickly food can move through the intestine of the animal, and consequently how much they are willing and able to eat. Now, we found species-wise, the French ceredellas had much lower fibre levels than the yellow ceredellas, and those fibre levels were comparable with the medics vetch that we saw last year as well. In terms of the cutting treatments, each cutting treatment, so from nothing through to 6 weeks or 6 weeks through to 2 weeks, it reduced the NDF enough. For example, a 50 kilo ewe would be able to eat roughly 200 grams more a day. That 200 grams can be the difference between that ewe being able to maintain her body condition and losing weight when the pasture quality just isn't great. Different grazing managements have a big effect on the quality of the feed and the availability of the feed. So if you are looking for more feed early or late in the season, you may be able to change your grazing management to preference feed at that pinch point of the year. There may be some value to choosing a different variety or diversifying the pastures available on your place to have some that are able to utilise unusual seasonal rainfall. For example, ceredella, which was a big focus of our trial, last year when we had a dry patch for most of spring and then some late November rainfall, due to their deeper root systems, the ceredellas were able to hold on, and then when that rain came, come up and provide high quality feed through into summer. There are some new things out there. There are some newer varieties of plants that you're familiar with, and there's some other varieties, other species that it might be worth looking into if those common varieties aren't thriving at your place, or you've got an older variety that might be susceptible to disease.
Hannah, thank you for sharing your professional knowledge and expertise about the potential benefits of new pasture legumes for livestock. This 10-minute talk was made possible by the support of Australian Wool Innovation, the Department of Primary Industries and Regions, and the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund.